Here we go. Okay, so I'm wondering how many people in the room are familiar with the term polycrisis. I wanted to write it on the board, but there's no whiteboard marker. Yeah, so many of you have heard of this term, right? It's this idea that now we're in a crisis of crises. So climate is playing out, climate is just one crisis amongst many. Climate is playing out in this context of multiple crises. And I think one that maybe we don't talk about enough is this kind of crisis of isolation and the crisis of overwhelm that's really hitting our society and has been hitting our society for decades. You know, capitalism is the crisis and it has many manifestations. And one of those is this increasing social isolation. So I think when we're going to talk about hope, which is so important to do, and there's been so many beautiful reflections on that today, trying to meet that with a real recognition of the depth and scale of the crisis and its complexity is really important, right? So we want to move in both, like move in that depth, that scale, that complexity, and that hope. So one aspect of that complexity and that polycrisis, again, is this kind of social isolation. So some of you are probably familiar with Robert Putnam's work from, at this point, decades ago, and Bowling Alone, where he did this massive study of social capital and found that by basically every conceivable measure, social capital, so just the connections that we have out in society, like the vitality of our civil society, has declined. And when you look at what he studied, it's like all over the map. Like he took in all these different data, things like how likely was it that someone gave someone the finger while they were driving within the last week? Like that's one of the measures that he looked at. So looking at all these ways that we kind of have a cohesive and supportive society and recognizing that they're dramatically declining. And it's definitely by no means just an American phenomenon. Like even in Vancouver, you know, from the Vancouver Foundation's research that participation in almost every community-related activity in Vancouver has been declining. So here's some of the statistics about that. And this is before the pandemic. So this is from their Engage and Connect report in 2017. So the number of people who participated in a neighborhood or community project had dropped from 23% to 9%. Who had attended a neighborhood or community meeting, 26% to 17%, attended religious services, 40% to 22%. So just dramatic declines in how much people are actually participating in civil society. And the main obstacles that people identify are that they don't have enough time, they're not aware of opportunities, they don't have enough money, right? So poverty has a massive impact here, and the affordability crisis makes it worse. A feeling that they don't have much to offer. So this is a huge question around kind of self-esteem and people knowing and having a sense of purpose and meaning and contribution, and then feeling unwelcome. Religious disaffiliation is obviously a big part of this. I think there's certain elements of secularization that really make sense to celebrate, and others that create a much more challenging landscape for trying to build a climate movement, right? We're not in a setting like the civil rights movement where you have churches that can gather people together and get them to engage deeply in forming beliefs and then get out in the world and act on them and be organized. So, you know, we're in a part of the world that is dramatically secular. 52% of people have no religious affiliation. And I mean, there's just, I could go on and on and on. Like there's so much evidence of this kind of crisis of isolation and overwhelm and burnout and loneliness. And we know that climate disasters are really going to require community resilience. So again, I think most of you are based here, not too far away, but for our Tilburg people, when we had the heat dome in 2021 and 619 people died, one of the biggest factors was poverty and isolation and age. Those are kind of the big factors there. People just didn't have the social supports that could help them get out of the heat and into something livable. So in this context, a lot of us who've done movement building have come together to say, okay, we have to think about doing this a little bit differently, but what does that mean? Like, do it differently how? So Peter Murray wrote this very helpful article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review around 10 years ago, where he looked at why civic organizations aren't scaling up. And he said that he looked at which ones were not, the vast majority that were not, and then the few that really were. And what he was able to isolate about the ones that grow and become really powerful was that they used a model called functional organizing. So what he discovered from this was that organizations that use the functional organizing model, so the key examples that he talks about, the Association for the Advancement of Retired Persons in the US, so that is about quality of life for retired people. It has 37 million members. It still has the highest circulation publication in the US, which is their magazine that people get. And then he looked also at the NRA, the National Rifle Association. Again, egregious work that they do. Probably nobody in this room agrees with it. But what are they doing? What is the model that they have that has allowed them to scale? And you look at the way that the AARP and the NRA are scaling, they are so much bigger than even if you combine a whole bunch of advocacy organizations together, they're nowhere near as big as the AARP and the NRA. So like the next biggest organization is NARAL, that's about reproductive choice. This data is a little bit old. They've grown a lot after the Dobbs decision. So as reproductive rights have become more under threat in the US, NARAL has grown, but they're still nowhere near as big as the AARP or even the NRA. So what do the AARP and the NRA do? They offer benefits and services, a media platform, and they build community. Something that most advocacy organizations that we think of, especially that work on climate, really don't do that much. So you think people join the NRA because they're like gun owners who really desperately want to prevent like a ban on assault rifles. Maybe for some people that's why they join, but the point when most people join the NRA is some kind of service that's beneficial to them. Like many people join the NRA for the death and dismemberment insurance that they get as a gun owner. Yeah. Yeah, so that's the benefit. They get a discount on that insurance. They get hunting clubs and classes and family programs and all these different, and the NRA magazine. So they get all these different benefits. So a group of us, my climate plan co-founders, me and Manu and Adam and Cici Chox and Jamie, are creating this, taking this model, which we now call beneficial membership, and trying to apply it to climate. So how do we create a climate organization that takes those successful principles of like the NRA and the AARP and applies them to climate? And so we've started developing a suite of benefits that people who are actively concerned about climate change might be interested in getting. So one of the key benefits, and if you're in the poster gallery, there's a QR code you can use. I think it's at the end of the presentation too, but to take you to our prototype of our platform, which is a website where you can put in your postal code and find out what the climate impacts are in a few areas where you are. And then you can create a plan. So you can actually start to say, like, what's my plan for fire, for smoke, for floods, for storms? And eventually we'll be adding in areas around food and money. So feeling like you've been able to develop some household climate resilience. But we really want it to be like not just at the individual or household level, but at the community level. So how can we start to actually build community resilience? So we're also doing these events like Climate Ready is a series that we run that I'm going to give you a little demo of at the end of today. So we'll actually experience like what is a Climate Ready event like in a condensed format. And then we're also doing other kinds of community events like one in James Bay that I'm going to talk about a little bit more. We have a media platform where we send out a newsletter, a weekly newsletter. And then we're also now starting to move into doing advocacy. So the NRA doesn't necessarily lead with advocacy, but as we all probably know, they do a ton of advocacy. And so we just started our first campaign this summer around doubling funding for wildland firefighters who are like dramatically underpaid. Like we have this incredibly heart-wrenching story from someone who was a career wildland firefighter, where just they're sort of churned up by a system that hires them on these very temporary contracts. They burn out at the end, no pun intended, at the end of the season, and there's no benefits for them. And they're not paid enough really to survive and continue doing this work. So we're doing this campaign around doubling the funding for them and their equipment. And then we also have discounts and savings. So you can, if you're in the Victoria area, you can save $1,000 on a heat pump if you're a Climate Plan member. And there's a discount in Vancouver and there's a discount in Toronto, and we hope to keep expanding that. And we also have discounts on things like masks, and we have discounts on emergency kits, which I'll talk about a little bit more. So this is the platform. Get Climate Safe. You can put in your postal code and find out more. Yeah. Okay. Okay, sure. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, thank you. Okay, so here's a little bit more about our model. We want to recruit people through reaching them with storytelling around climate impacts at a particular moment. We help them then come into our organization by creating a plan or getting discounts. And then we want to deepen the relationship by actually organizing them in communities. And we have a similar but slightly different model in the Indigenous communities that we're planning on working in. That work is led by our co-founder, CC Tiox, around looking at what Indigenous people who have a very different relationship, obviously, to these disasters need in order to really be resilient in their communities. So the idea is that this kind of membership can lead to like really big, significant policy wins. So if you look at the AARP, they have 38 million members. They make about $1.9 billion a year from that, which is a lot. And through that, they've leveraged $2.2 trillion in Social Security and Medicare spending. So in a context where the American government has been trying to slash programs anywhere and everywhere they can, the AARP has been this bastion of preventing that from happening to some of these really key programs that really have a very meaningful impact on the well-being of their members, like whether or not they have old age security. Okay. And we had a market intelligence study done that predicted we could reach 220,000 paying members and have $29 million in revenue by 2028 in Canada, the US, and the UK, which would be phenomenal. We would love that. It's a lot of people. It's also not quite enough to actually have the kind of impacts on policy that we want to have. So we're also looking at how those people can be the right people, like the strategic people to reach. So most climate communications, especially in the more kind of advocacy and activist world, is really aimed at the alarmed, right? It's people who are already freaked out. But there's a whole segment, and those of you who do this kind of work out in the advocacy world have probably heard this phrase before about, there's a whole segment called the movable middle of people that we aren't necessarily reaching very well right now, but are very ready to be engaged. So they're concerned or they're cautious about climate, but they're not currently active the way that probably almost everybody in this room is within the alarmed. So part of the challenge of the next little while is to reach the movable middle, especially because if you look at the ridings, so the swing ridings that actually matter in an election, where a politician actually feels like they need to try to do something different in order to win, those ridings are very much dominated by movable middle type people. And 97% of those ridings are suffering from climate extremes. Like they're suffering from heat, flood, smoke. Of course they are. So to reach folks in the movable middle, in those ridings with a message saying the wildfire is happening because of fossil fuels. So now what are we going to do about that? And also, we're going to really help and support you. Like, we're not going to just contribute to your sense of overwhelm. We're going to find a way to engage you that feels like it offers you something that you really need in this time of polycrisis. So yes, through that, we aim to create a felt benefit around, we helped you get an emergency kit. Ideally, we'd eventually like to be doing things like mutual aid around wildfires, right? Helping people connect. And then from there, we translate that into support and then channel that into policy. So that's our model that we're working on. And our vision is that everyone is in a climate safe community. So our definition of that is a climate safe community is prepared, welcoming, and engaged. We very much have a lens too on what's going to happen with climate refugees, that Canada, Turtle Island, is a place that needs to be preparing to welcome like millions and millions of people. And so what does that look like? How do we create communities that welcome? people in, that welcome newcomers and can connect across difference. So here's again some of the benefits that we offer. We've done some webinars, some discounts. This is Mike, who offers the $1,000 off the heat pump in Victoria. And in the future, we'd like to do kind of like work parties, like everybody get together in a neighborhood, do that weather stripping that you really need to do that makes your house more energy efficient and more resilient. And then let's all go have like a drink in the park together kind of thing. And we have some, as I mentioned, we have benefits on things like emergency kits. This is a little project that we're planning for my neighborhood, which is called, James Bay, Victoria, unceded traditional territories of the Swanghung, who are Lekwungen speaking people. So we are, I wanted to include this because it kind of gives you like a flavor of this type of organizing, which is like meeting people where they're at. Again, saying like, you're overwhelmed, come have some pizza. Bring your, like, we're going to do it, in the community center that's embedded in a school right after school ends. Just come with your family, have some pizza, and let's talk about what this community needs in order to be climate resilient. And we hope that that will then be like a prototype that can happen in communities all across Canada. And we're also doing something with ice cream socials right now, but I didn't have a cute graphic for it yet. But we got some funding to offer like community groups around just $200 to provide ice cream at an ice cream social that's also like a climate circle, a climate conversation. And for me, again, as I bring in some of the chaplaincy and the faith-based work, like I think about what are those elements of religious community that we've really lost, intergenerational, family-friendly, like supporting families, forming people into a community that has shared values and makes meaning of things together, and very much organized around mutual aid. How do we actually support each other through all of this? So this is getting into Climate Ready, which is this workshop series that we've run in a few different contexts. This is from when I ran it at the Multi-Faith Center at UVic, and Ryan was at the first one. So these are these sessions that we run on how to prepare for climate change. And there's 4 different ones. Each is on a different theme. And they really combine like practical, how do we actually plan and get ready for climate change, with a real spiritual component around how can we be intentional about who we're going to be in this crisis? And how can we bring our best selves to this and actually use climate change as an opportunity to think deeply about maybe how we've been socialized that actually isn't according to our highest integrity? And what does it look like to unlearn that? Like all the stuff we've been talking about today about decolonizing our imaginary, how do we then bring that into a conversation about preparing for climate change? So the first session is on, oh my gosh, I'm now blanking. The first session is on crisis. So what does it mean to treat climate as a crisis? Like, what does that mean for the neurobiology of stress? How do we develop tools around that? The second session is on emergency, which is the one I'm going to give you a little demo of today. And then there's one on justice. So talking about the big picture of climate justice, what that means, all the different issues that are connected and implicated, but also then how do you find your own personal work to do within that? And in that session on justice, for those of you who were just here for Chris Scotto-Jones's talk, in that session on justice, we go a lot into hope. Like, what is our personal relationship to hope? Because I think my feeling at this point, hope is something I get asked about all the time in the work that I do. And my feeling is that hope is just a very deeply personal and a very dynamic kind of question. So our relationship to hope is going to change all the time from moment to moment, from day to day, depending on what we're doing. We may be hopeless, we may be hopeful, or we may be hope-free in the sense that Chris just talked about, like having a Buddhist radical orientation to the present moment that makes us kind of let go of ideas about the future, good or bad. So we're going to cycle through being hopeless, being hopeful, being hope-free. And part of it is like recognizing what our spirit needs in any given moment. Like, am I hopeless in a way where I need to reconnect to the possibility of hope? Or am I hopeless in a way where I just need to give that space and be with that and go through that right now? So that's in the justice session. We talked quite a bit about that all important question of hope. And then I do a final one on change. So like profoundly, this is a question about what is our relationship to change? Do we resist? Do we flow? How do we resist effectively in a way that doesn't take a toll on us personally too much, that doesn't burn us out? And how do we learn how to kind of flow and be intentional with what change looks like at every level, like society, on the societal level, on the individual level, and how do we skillfully help others who may be experiencing a lot deeper discomfort with change learn how to flow? Okay. So let's go into what like a session looks like. I'm talking about emergency. I didn't put this material in because I didn't think I would have time for it, but in a normal 90-minute session, I would go over a lot of Seth Klein's work that you were referencing around why call climate an emergency? Like what is the benefit and the value from a policy perspective of declaring climate an emergency and therefore being able to marshal public resources towards it? And then we would all, I would encourage everybody to sign the Climate Emergency Units petition, which it was around building a youth climate corps. That was kind of their main campaign. So we would talk about the kind of politics of emergency, like what does the emergency frame mean at a political and policy level? And then talking about what does emergency mean at like a household and community level? So preparing for an emergency. I really love this cartoon by Brenna Quinlan around not being the kind of prepper who's hiding, but the kind of prepper who's out in the world able to share. I think that's like really where we want to get to, but that also means we have to like feel ready ourselves, right? Like we have to feel like we have enough and we are enough and we can share. We don't come at it with a scarcity mentality, but have like some sense of abundance. And that's going to be really important as we're thinking about the disasters that are probably going to come. So it's a little bit unusual to do this in Vancouver or Victoria because probably our most likely disaster is still an earthquake, which is one of the very few that isn't affected by climate change in our area anyway, although in parts of the world where there's fracking, they're more connected. But we're also going to be seeing floods and fires and storms and multiple disasters at once. And some of us might still have a sense that we're like maybe a little bit insulated from that, but the reality is probably none of us are. Like, I don't know how many of you had friends who were in Ottawa or Halifax during these sustained periods of power outage. But we kind of think like, oh, it's a power outage, we'll get through it. Actually, when it goes on for multiple days, like it's a pretty big deal and something that you really do want to have been prepared for and be ready to respond to and be ready to really respond well as a community. So Rebecca Solnit talks about this root of the word emergency and emergence, like rising up to meet an occasion. And she went and looked at the communities that do that really well in disaster, right? Recognizing that disaster is something we really fear, but can sometimes actually bring out the best in us and the best in the people around us. So how can we be ready to rise, to emerge when there's an emergency? So that kind of preparation can be very emotional work. So if we were in the 90-minute session with pre-registration, we would all be making a kit together. Or those of you who already have them, sorry, the mic is very feedbacky. Those of you who already have them would be like bringing your kit to show or bringing pictures of your kit, but most people don't have them. So I'm going to pass this around. This is like a very, very simple, actually, I can sell these. I have a couple extras. They're $100. That's like slightly below the cost of actually putting it together. A very basic emergency kit. And why do you think it's in this kind of bag? Anybody have any? Yes. Sorry? Yeah, partly because it's water resistant. Maybe you can't really tell, but it's an insulated. Yeah, keep things cold. Yeah, so that's going to be like one of the first challenges is that if you don't have refrigeration for an extended period of time, everyone's going to be looking for like the most cold storage they can find. So in my house, we actually keep our emergency kit in like a big hard-sided rolling cooler. Because like that's the first thing. I had a lot of friends during the sustained power outage in Halifax saying, I feel like the best thing I can do is treat this like camping. Like I'm just trying to keep everything cold for my family for 4, 5, 6 days. So having a little bit of extra cold storage is something everybody wants to think about. And then some of the stuff is like very obvious, you know, a crank radio, an emergency blanket. Some of the things that you might not have thought about, but are good to think about. Lots of black garbage bags. Does anybody have a guess about why? Not just for garbage. That could be a use for it for sure. Heat, yeah, another possibility. Garbage. So they're actually to make a dry toilet because the possibility of your water not working anymore is pretty high. So one of the first things the city would probably do is organize solid waste collection, right? We're getting real here. So you line your toilet with a garbage bag, you put another garbage bag on top of it, and that's what you use until that service gets restored. So you want a pretty good amount of them. And again, just something like we don't necessarily think about this, especially if we're like a certain kind of comfortable middle class, like we haven't had to go through this before. Whereas there are communities that, you know, hurricane was a regular occurrence, right? That they were just used to. And now what they're facing is the scale is really changing because of climate. But we probably haven't, most of us probably haven't been through necessarily that kind of disaster before. So we might not think about that. And then some clear bags for windows, right? If windows are broken, to put them on the windows and tape them. I'm going to pass this around. So people want to take a look at it, they can. And then this is the go bag for my daughter, who's 4. And it has some clothes and snacks and a toothbrush and toothpaste and a fun flashlight and a bag of Skittles and some crayons and her little stuffy. And it also has her picture and a picture of her brother, my son. Getting real, right? Because if I'm looking for her, I want to have her picture. And it has her emergency contacts all written on it, because if someone else is looking for her, I want them to have that. So, right? Maybe we all need another breath. So I think that's part of why we kind of struggle to prepare, right? Is that it is really emotional work. Like we actually have to confront what might actually happen. Like, what are the scenarios? I'll encourage you all to do this, to put a little reminder in your phone if you want to now, to either create a kit or to update your kit if you already have one. And then let's get into what all of that kind of raises around the spiritual side of this work to rebuild our resilience as individuals and as communities. So a question that I want to ask you to reflect on, and I think we have some time to talk about it in groups of 2, is how can we be in a state of emergency and a state of grace at the same time? So Christiana Figueres, she was a climate negotiator, Costa Rican climate negotiator, who's really moved into doing this kind of spiritual work around climate. She talks a lot about how we have to adjust to the idea of chronic emergency. Like that emergency used to mean something acute. And now it's going to mean something chronic. And that requires a different relationship to it. I think that really raises the question of how can we then be in that state of emergency if it's going to be chronic, and also figure out how to be in a state of grace at the same time. So that's a question here today. And grace isn't a word we use a lot in the secular world. Like, it's not a concept that we necessarily talk about very much, or maybe have any kind of shared sense of. But most wisdom traditions and faith traditions have some real teaching about grace, like something about grace that they try to offer people who are cultivating those faith practices. And again, all these traditions have like multiple voices and many different perspectives. I'm just offering a little taste of one. So for Christians, right, that state of grace is that feeling of oneness from God. Nadia Bowles-Weber, if you're interested in this part of the tradition, like, she's somebody to really read about, because she talks a lot about grace, and a lot about grace as something that doesn't have to be earned. It just naturally is there. If you think about what Islam might have to say about grace, a core practice of Islam is meditating on the names of God, right? One of which is the most gracious. So what does it mean to think about emulating the most gracious being we can imagine? So in Won Buddhism, this is the patriarch Sotasan, they talk a lot about grace as recognizing the 4 different graces that exist, and the grace of nature, the grace of parents, the grace of community, and sorry, I lost my slide on this. But the fundamental idea is like a sense of interconnectedness with everything that is, in particular the natural world and with other people. And that out of that kind of state, a feeling of deep, deep gratitude arises. I think, Ryan, you were talking about bringing in Joanna Macy. So much of Joanna Macy's work is centered around the fact that when we start to feel disconnected and burnt out, we need to find a way to reground into gratitude. So what are we still able to be grateful for? And for Won Buddhism, we have these indispensable relationships in our lives. We're like woven into this network of mutuality. So recognizing that and really dwelling in our appreciation for it.